Welcome back to our tutorial series on how to measure the client-side performance of a web application. In this tutorial, I will talk about the impact of a device or a computer's computing power on the performance of your web pages. If you are looking at a website which is not very computing intensive or not very graphics intensive, you may not see the impact that much. But if you are developing a site which is very heavily dependent on the computing, like scripting, painting, animation, and things like that, you will definitely feel the impact of the computing power. So for this demonstration purpose, I chose the site which is moderately computing and the painting heavy. So this is a gaming site that I ran into, so I decided to choose that. So before we discuss the impact, so let's look at the different aspects of a web page life cycle which will impact the performance. So the life of a web page starts by downloading the HTML and the data from the server. That performance is dependent on your network bandwidth. The second aspect is that after the data has been downloaded on the browser, then it has to take that data. Depending on how you built the website, it's going to have to do your scripting magic, JavaScript. Then it's going to have to render the HTML. The static HTML is downloaded, and maybe some dynamic HTML that was created by your scripts. And as these tiles are being repositioned, that means your page is going to have to recompute the sizes and locations of your elements. And lastly, it has to do the painting. So the first part of downloading the data is dependent on your network bandwidth. The computing power of your device does not have a lot of impact on that. But the other aspect of scripting, painting, rendering is very heavily dependent on the computing power. So what computing power means is it depends on the type of CPU or CPU clock and the memory you have. Usually the websites don't utilize that much memory unless it's a very heavily animated website. But we will leave that discussion for some other time. So that means you have a dependency on the type of CPU and the CPU's clock. So how do we go about figuring it out? What is the impact? One way to do is that you buy a kind of a low-end machine and then do your testing on that one. That will become very expensive very quickly. Other way is that is there a way for us to simulate or throttle the CPU? Luckily, the Chrome's developer tools does have a way for you to specify throttling on the CPU of your device or machine. So let's see how that works. So in one of the earlier tutorials, I talked about the dev tools, where they are and how do you use them. So in this one, let's start by bringing up the dev tools on the Chrome browser. So on the dev tools, there is a performance tab. That is where you will be going to measure the performance of your page. So if you look at on this dev tools section on the right side, there is no way it tells you that how am I going to throttle the CPU. All it has is for you to record or reload, and then pick an option that do you want to capture screenshots, do you want to capture memory. Where I can go to throttle the CPU. So here it is that by default there is a ribbon right below this band where you have the screenshots memory options available. On the right you see there's a gear. This is usually closed by default. When you click on it, it opens. That is when you end up seeing more options available to you for throttling your network as well as CPU. So if you look at it, there are three options available to you. No throttling, throttle the CPU by 4 times, throttle the CPU by 6 times. So let's start doing some measurements. So first we're going to start a measurement of this page by saying no throttling. So let's see what happens. I'm going to click on the reload button. No throttling. Let's wait for DevTools to process the data. And once the data is processed, look at these numbers. So it says that it took about 3.69 seconds for this page to complete its rendering, including downloading the data. And it has provided the breakdown of these numbers: loading of the data, scripting, rendering, painting, and some idle time on it. So now let's see. So this is when there is no CPU throttle. Now if I want to see what is going to be the effect of a slower CPU, now I'm going to have to go and throttle my CPU to see. Now let's do a throttle by 4 times slower and do the same measurement again by reloading the page. Let's see, what do we get? DevTools processing the data, doing some profiling, and it is going to generate the information for us. Voila! You see, now we got some new numbers. Now that the CPU has been throttled by 4 times, you can see that the page rendering time has increased from 3.69 to 10.19 seconds. You can see that the parts of the page that really get impacted have increased their time. Scripting time has increased, rendering time has increased, painting time has increased. Now let's see what happens if we throttle this by 6 times. 6 times throttle. Profiling. Let's wait for DevTools to process the data. There we go. Processing is complete. Let's look at the numbers. You can see between 10 and 6 times there's not a lot of a difference, but definitely there's a big difference between no throttling and 4 to 6 times. So again, you can see that some numbers, the same kind of behavior is that the scripting, rendering, painting, and system times have increased. So this is how you kind of simulate the throttling of your CPU. Simulation is not a kind of an exact representation of a low-end machine, but at least it will give you some idea that if you have a user and they have some low-end machines, what kind of performance they are going to get. Hope it helps you understand how to measure the impact of CPU on the performance of your web pages. Thank you.